back, and this time we're going to talk about the resurrection, and it kind of that forms, as I hear you talking, and I've heard you lecture on campus here, at the center of your apologetic, which I think is a pretty good center. Tell us a little bit more about how you work this through.
Well, I look at it primarily at what is that central event on which everything else depends in Scripture. In other words, let's put it this way. If we convince somebody of that God created the world, we get them absolutely convinced of that, they're still lost at that point. If we convince them that there's a good reason for evil in the world, and we convince them that there's a good God still, they're still lost. And then we can go through all these different issues, but if we can help them understand, and if they embrace the implications and the truth of the resurrection of Jesus, then they, at least at an intellectual level, have the things going on to lead them to salvation. And so I think that's the thing. If we see apologetics not as something in which we're simply trying to argue for the sake of proving a point, but we're trying to aim people toward Jesus Christ, then the resurrection has to be central to what we do. And that I think is really an important thing for us to see, because I always try to help students not get caught up in that game that never goes well, which is where you're in a conversation with somebody and they keep bringing up, well, what about this? What about this? What about this? What about this? All these different things in Scripture. And eventually they'll get to something you can't answer, no matter how much you know. And with you and I, there's still, we can't answer everything. And certainly we can't expect a layperson in the church to be able to answer everything. So what I try to encourage students and lay people in churches to do is always run toward the resurrection of Jesus. Always run that direction. Never run any other direction. So when somebody brings up a topic, get as quick as you can to the resurrection of Jesus. And so that's how that forms the center of it, is use all the other topics, use those as a springboard to get you to a discussion about, is Jesus dead or is Jesus alive? That simple question.
Yeah, and just to piggyback off something you said, just because we're saying there's something that we can't answer or someone can't answer, there's some mysteries in the Christian faith. Welcome to life. Welcome to the world. There's, take any worldview, and there's some things to say, well, we're not sure about that. The thing about the Christian worldview is we say, if there is a God who is infinite and we're finite, and He's the God of the Bible, He promises us that there are things that we will not understand. So this is actually consistent with our worldview, that we're going to have certain gaps that we're just not sure about. It doesn't mean that we don't have something that makes sense of the world, makes good on its promises. And so that's not necessarily a cop-out, though I've interacted with some atheists and skeptics who say that's a cop-out. And then I think the thing to do at that point is to kind of press back on them and say, well, let me ask you some questions. But I think you raise a very important point, and that's when they're coming at you with all these questions, stump the Christian, they're going to get something that you can't fully answer. And so at that point, you're saying, go to the resurrection. Well, I mean, put some hands and feet on this for us. I mean, how do I go to the resurrection? What do I say? What evidence would be good at that point to bring up?
I think we bring up first and foremost that help them understand that the foundation of my faith is not a particular moral, it's not even Scripture itself, by itself in some sort of an abstract thing. The foundation of my faith is that Jesus Christ is alive. That's the central proclamation. So to help them understand that, because there are people, if you talk to them in the world, that think that the center of our faith is some sort of just moral practice or something like that. So first off, to help them understand that the stand or fall thing in my faith, what I stand or fall and what I believe by, is the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And then to confront them with, asking them the question, do you believe that Jesus died and rose from the dead? To ask them that simple question and to hone in on and hammer in on, do you believe that Jesus is alive? And because that really reveals some things about what they're really thinking. But it also reveals some things about how illiterate they are, we might say, because some of them they may be saying, well, I don't know, I've never thought about it. Some people may say, well, I don't even think Jesus existed. Some people may say, well, I do believe Jesus is alive, I just don't believe this other stuff. It really is a good question to hone in on, to find out where they're at spiritually. So that's, I think, one of the first things. And then to help them understand that in comparison with other ancient literature, ancient events, ancient things that happen in history, the resurrection is one of the best attested events in history. It really is, in terms of ancient history. It's as well attested as many other events in ancient history. And I think it's important that we recognize that, because in the case of the resurrection, you have multiple witnesses testifying to something in slightly different terms in that. And one of the analogies I use with people in that is if you're in a courtroom and you have multiple witnesses tell the same story, but they don't tell it the same word for word, because then you'd think they just got together on this. But they tell the same story, but in slightly different terms. That suggests to you that event really occurred. Well, that's what we have at a very practical, fundamental level in the resurrection of Jesus.
Mm-hmm. So let me push back a little bit, because as you talk about this, there could be various types of people listening, non-believers listening, maybe non-believing historians listening, and they might say, well, me and other historians that I work with, we're not Christians and we don't believe in the resurrection, so how can you make this case that it's so well attested in history when all of me and my peers in my guild don't affirm the resurrection? We're not believers. We don't think a dead man can rise from the grave. We don't think Jesus did it.
There's a couple of things I would say back to that. Number one is, I would argue very strongly that if you apply the same standards to the sources we have about the resurrection that you apply to other events, that we would come to the conclusion of a strong likelihood that the resurrection occurred. Mm-hmm. But I would also even push a little bit further and say that in most cases, the reason we don't believe somebody can rise from the dead is because we have adopted a presupposition that we have to approach history in a way that rules out the supernatural. Mm-hmm. Often the way that this is stated, which is ultimately just a paraphrase of David Hume back hundreds of years ago, which is to say history is that which probably happened, and a miracle by the very nature of the case is improbable, therefore a miracle can never be historical. That's kind of the logical reasoning right there. It's very problematic, and Hume was blown out of the water in his own day and has been over and over since then for kind of that approach but it's still become very dominant, that view. The problem with it is that miracles are only improbable if you assume that there is no God. Mm-hmm. Because if you assume there is no God, miracles are improbable. If there is a God, then a miracle is not necessarily improbable. And so I think one of the things that we miss in that there's some parts of that worldview that are working their way in at that point in that. So what I suggest that we do is leave the question of the probability or improbability open, because ultimately, if God is there, a miracle is perfectly probable. If there is no God, a miracle obviously is highly improbable. I think what people mean, really, rather than probable and probability, they're talking about frequency, not probability at that point. Miracles are infrequent. That we would say is true in that. But the infrequency of a miracle doesn't have to do with whether it happened historically or not. It doesn't speak to whether it's historically accurate, historically possible. None of that's part of that. It's simply saying it doesn't happen very often. Yeah. And so I think there's this conflating of the ideas of probability and frequency that is problematic in that as well.
Yeah. One of the things with the resurrection is there's great literature on the resurrection. If you have a lot of time, N.T. Wright's big book, 800-page book. If you're a student, Mike Lacona's work on the resurrection. Do you have some that you could recommend?
I would recommend definitely. Those would be the two at the top of my list as well. Both of those texts are just outstanding and demonstrating, really, especially Mike Lacona's trying to say, basically, let's play by the rules of a historical of history and see what the probability is, and does an exceptional work at that point.
Those are thick thick volumes. Truth Matters. I'm one of the co-authors of that for students, and we have a part on the resurrection. Do you, in any of your works, deal with the resurrection directly, even in chapters? You could.
Yeah, I've got a book called Conspiracies in the Cross that I deal with, especially the issue of whether Jesus' body might have been left on the cross or simply discarded at that point. We're dealing with Roman laws at that point, and dealing with the probability of the resurrection and conspiracies in the cross.
Very good. And so one thing to bring up, one way to take people to the cross is if they have an issue with the ethics of the Bible, with some part that they don't feel comfortable with Christianity, is say, listen, if Jesus rose from the dead, then I'm going to listen to him, and you should too. If he didn't, then don't listen to him.
Right.
But the real issue is, did Jesus rise from the dead? And you can drive people to the cross and the resurrection in that way, and have a good, fruitful gospel conversation. Yes. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you. Great to be with you.